Kizamde! Ham on the beat!
Welcome back to Debunking Araki Forgot. This time we'll finally be taking a look at the 8th part of JoJo, JoJolion, which began in 2011 and finished in August of 2021. In the time period after it finished publishing, I was able to compile all of the topics I'll be talking about in this video. Probably the strangest thing about JoJolion when it comes to this topic is that we were already discussing it before it even finished. So there's a host of topics that almost aren't even worth discussing, since they eventually just got resolved by the manga itself. Regardless, I do still think there's plenty to talk about, including some connections I think others may have missed. JoJolion does have a pretty complex story compared to the other parts of JoJo, so hopefully this video will help people understand certain parts of it better. The first topic comes from the very first chapter. Some ask why it is that Yasuho says she hasn't kissed anyone yet, but then we later learn that she was at least sexually active with her ex-boyfriend Toru. This topic might confuse some people since you may not remember Yasuho saying this line at all. Well, you're right to think that, since this is actually a mistranslation. Most of the more popular scans have the correct translation, which is Yasuho talking about how she once kissed Joshu in the past, and that's why he fell in love with her. The first translation is a remnant of some of the early days of JoJolion's publishing, where we had some conflicting translations, some of which were pretty bad. Next is the walleyes phenomenon that appears prominently in the part. There's been quite a few claims that people have made about the walleyes, so much that I actually ended up making a video about it quite some time ago. But the main idea back then was that while the walleyes were present in the beginning of the story, they were later forgotten about and even disappeared from the background entirely. Of course, this turned out to not be the case, and the walleyes not only began to appear again, but even got some further explanation. In the cases of people saying the walleyes were no longer visible for a while, they seem to be forgetting the actual location of the walleyes. They appeared along the coastal parts of Morioh after the earthquake. The stretch of time where they don't appear as much happens when the characters are either indoors for long periods, such as when they're at the hospital, or further inland, such as when Mamizuku is introduced. However, even with the walleyes returning, some are not satisfied with the amounts of explanation we were given. This is a point that's going to come up a lot this time, since unlike with any other part of JoJo I've talked about, for the first time we have no idea what the future might hold. For example, back in part 1, we had no idea what the origins of the stone mask were, but they were later explained in part 2. Likewise, the phenomenon of stands was introduced in part 3, followed by the stand arrow in part 4, and finally the origin of the arrow in part 5. We were also introduced to Dio's plan that he was collecting stand users for in part 4, which later became the focus of part 6. Much of the phenomena seen in Steel Ball Run and JoJolion will likely be expanded on further in part 9. In the meantime, however, I feel like the explanations we've been given are pretty satisfactory. We learned about the walleyes having connections to the Devil's Palms from part 7, and it was heavily implied that the accident involving Johnny Joestar was the cause of their appearance in Morioh. Johnny stored the saint's corpse underneath the Twin Pines of Morioh, and this location was later home to a shrine that the Higashikata family used to gain access to the powers of the walleyes. This shrine was also directly associated with Johnny's legend, so as far as the origin of the walleyes, it has been addressed. What hasn't been addressed is the complete role that the blessings from the earth play, which is what we're likely to learn about in the future. Similarly, the bite marks featured early in the part are another topic people bring up. In the first chapter, we see that Josuke has gotten a human-like bite mark on his back after being near the walleyes. Yasuho and Joshu also both experienced bite marks after going near Josuke. The bite marks eventually healed, but weren't given much focus again. Most likely these are some kind of symptom for going near the walleyes. The walleyes are known for having a power to grant stands, so for a while a lot of people, including me, believed that the bite marks themselves were what granted the stands. However, this later became unconfirmed, since we learned later that Yasuho already had subconscious access to her stand as a child. Both halves of Josuke were also stand users. In Joshu's case, we don't really know for sure if he gained Nut King Call because of the bite mark, or if it was just already in him from living near the walleyes and just now awakened. So while it is possible the bite marks are related to gaining stands, we don't have any evidence right now to support it. I think if there's anything further we learn about the bite marks, it would come with whatever more we learn about the blessings from the earth in Part 9. During the fight with Ojiro, Josuke experiences a brief vision of a man with blonde hair in front of the walleyes. This was one of the more puzzling things from throughout the part, and it ended up not coming up again. People have posed their own explanations over the years, but I wasn't completely convinced since I still thought it might come up again. Now that we've reached the end, I think we now need to re-examine some of those explanations. While it's not a complete impossibility that this could come up in Part 9, I'm not holding my breath. We don't know enough about the future to really know for sure, so I'm not satisfied with leaving it at that. The most likely scenario here is that this is an early design for another character. Which character that this is the real tough question. Some say that it's Ojiro, but that doesn't really make any sense since Ojiro himself appears very soon after and he looks nothing like it. Same with Kira, who appeared in the very next chapter. It definitely has to be a character that appears quite a distance from the flashback in order for such a design change to take place, and also one that Josefumi or Kira would have seen. Another popular choice is Damo, who they did encounter shortly before the fusion. I find this unlikely, however, since it's such a drastic change in the design. I think the most likely person here would be Yotsuyu. He's the next real villain that Josuke encounters. He does have at the very least a similar physique and hairstyle. And similar to Damo, he was present for Josefumi and Kira before their fusion. I don't think we'll end up getting a real answer to this question until the time of the Part 8 anime. The anime adaptations have always made certain changes here and there, and in some cases Araki himself has even been asked by David Production to provide some additional details. So I think it's possible that's when we'll find out whose design this was meant to be, and it'll be replaced by that in the anime. After Josuke and Yasuho discover the corpse of Yoshikage Kira, we have a brief scene where a naked person is hiding in a trash can. For whatever reason, people seem to be confused about who this is. This is the woman who was kidnapped by Ojiro and kept inside Kira's apartment. First of all, she's naked just like the person we see later. She also mentions that she came from Tokyo, and the person in the trash can says they want to go back to Tokyo. So it's clearly her. But somehow I've actually gotten comments that think the person in the trash can is Kira, whose body had just been discovered. They somehow think that he just got up and walked away without anyone noticing and that he was forgotten about by Araki. The next topic involves the marking that was found written on the arm of Kira's corpse. This same mark was later found in the Higashikata House, and eventually traced to a book that was upstairs that contained the family tree. For this topic, we have a few different things to talk about. The first question is what the mark is. This was directly answered in the story. It's the logo of a bookseller. This is why it was present on the book. Next, why was it on Kira's arm? It was mentioned that it appears it's written on his arm the same way you'd write down a phone number to remember it. This was also answered later on when it was said that Kira snuck into the house to remove Kei's name from the book in order to hide her identity. So Kira learned what the logo on the book was like, wrote it down, and then used that to make sure he found the right book. All of that was directly answered, so the only question remaining is why it was written throughout the house. The only other mention of this comes from Yasuho when she remembers the mark. She says that she saw it there back when she was a child, written on random places like the stair rail or the leg of the chair. I feel the answer to this is simpler than we think, and that the mark was just doodled there by the children in the house after seeing it in the book upstairs. In one scene, Josuke briefly sees that Daiya's leg is injured, but it is healed immediately after. This is what causes him to fuss over Daiya and allows his memory to be taken. At first, people believed this was another part of Daiya's ability, which we would see if her stand was used again. But since her ability wasn't used again, it's not possible to confirm this. I think what this actually is was Daiya showing Josuke one of her memories. She mentions that it's possible to view the memories inside the chess pieces. So it's possible that one of these memories is of her with an injury, and by using that, she tricks Josuke into becoming her slave. This would also be an easy method for collecting memories from people, explaining why she has so many. When Yasuho visits Holly in the hospital, she's able to see Paisley Park and realizes that Yasuho is a stand user. The fact that she can see this would indicate that she has a stand. Some ask why this stand never ended up appearing in the part. In the past, we saw that Holly is fully aware of Kira's ability, since she asks him to use it to save Josefumi. If she's had a full stand for that long, it's definitely odd that her ability isn't known, so most likely she's a person with a dormant stand. This is almost exactly like the situation with the original Holly, since she was able to see Star Platinum but wasn't yet showing any signs of actually having a stand. Her stand eventually did appear after being forced out by the distress signal from Jonathan's body, but it eventually disappeared after Dio was defeated. However, her stand wouldn't just vanish completely. It would go back to being dormant until she theoretically awakens it normally in the future. I think this is also true for this Holly. While she does have a dormant stand and can see other stands, she can't actually use hers on her own. However, the end of Part 8 does still leave Holly in a coma, with Josuke mentioning the possibility of healing her in the future. So it's possible that if she is revived, she could eventually have an awakening. But until then, it's the same as the Holly from the original universe. Early in the story, it's shown that Josuke has a talent for seeing the exact measurements of things. Some have asked what the purpose of this was. This was answered by another moment that happens later, where we see Holly doing the same thing. This is the first hint that the two characters are related. His ability to measure things from a distance may also be a callback to Kira in Part 4, who did something similar during the final battle. During the fight with Born This Way, Josuke is attacked by the stand and pushes back against it. Some ask how this is possible if stand users cannot make contact with stands. As I've explained in a few of the previous debunking videos, this is not the case. When a stand is attacking, it becomes tangible. Otherwise, it would simply phase through anything it touches. If Born This Way were intangible, it wouldn't be able to attack Josuke at all. It would just run straight through him. So clearly it has to be tangible, and as a result, Josuke can touch it. Near the end of Part 7, Diego said that once the corpse was locked in the underground vault, it would take 80 years to reach it by force. However, some say that this was contradicted in Part 8, when we see in the flashback that Johnny steals the corpse from the vault in Manhattan. However, what Diego is most likely saying here is that it would be unreachable by conventional means. With the infinite rotation, Johnny would be able to make this process much easier. Also, Diego didn't even think Johnny would be an issue, since he had just abandoned him under the effects of the spin. He didn't know that Steven would show up and save Johnny. Also, it's unknown if the corpse was actually sealed away in the way Diego describes. Diego never actually turned the dial to lower the elevator with the corpse on it. Lucy killed him before he was able to. Once Steven showed up, the door to the vault was shut, but we don't know if it was actually sealed away. So the corpse may just be on the other side of the door, which Johnny could reach easily. A lot of people seem to have misconceptions when it comes to Johnny's death. Johnny was found with his head crushed by a boulder. However, people seem to just completely miss the reason for this happening and think the boulder just randomly killed him. Others even think this happened as a result of Wonder of You. What actually happened was that Johnny used the corpse he had stored under the Twin Pines and the Golden Rotation to transfer the rock disease from his son onto himself. As a result of this event, the ground of Morioh gained the power of the Walleyes and the Autumn Leaves stand was created, which was featured in the Shakedown Road arc. This stand is what moved the boulder onto him after Johnny had already shot himself. In Chapter 22, Yasuho discovers a newspaper article that talks about a baby that washed up on the shores of Morioh on the same day as Johnny's death. Many people ask what the meaning of this was meant to be. While this isn't mentioned again, its connection to Johnny's legend is undeniable. This serves as a hint to the origin of the Walleye's power. Back in Part 7, the Saint's corpse served as the main goal of the story, but we also learned that many other saints exist throughout the world. Saints are individuals who exhibit an exceptional degree of perfection by adhering to the golden ratio. This is the equation that all life is based on, and by tapping into it, you can access infinite energy. This is the origin of powers such as spin. Saints also have this power, and their corpses continue to grant good fortune after their deaths. A person is considered a saint when 2 miracles are attributed to them after they die. This baby is an example of one of these miracles. As a person who mastered the golden ratio and who sacrificed himself for his wife and son, Johnny became a saint. His actions created the Walleyes, which are a similar phenomenon to the devil's palms created by the saint's corpse. Both of these are referred to with the shared label of blessings from the earth. The Twin Pines became home to a shrine associated with them. which later caused the miracle of protecting the area around the Higashikata property from the 2011 earthquake. Near the end of the story, we're introduced to the powers of Calamity, a negative force that essentially operates like extremely bad luck. The opposite of Calamity is the power of miracles that is found in the corpse and the golden ratio. Back in Part 7, Poco Loco was shown to have a great deal of inherent luck, so much that it created a stand. His luck was also described as a kind of flow, just like how Calamity is described in Part 8. The appearance of a baby that somehow survived being swept up in the ocean, and even somehow ended up with precious jewels, is an example of the extreme good luck caused by the power of miracles. Immediately after the scene with the newspaper, Yasuho is pulled down underneath the tree into a room with a shadowy figure who licks her. In the next chapter, she wakes up in the underground bunker of the Higashikata property with Tsurugi. Some people have asked who this person was supposed to be, and how Yasuho suddenly got from the tree to the bunker. I thought it was made pretty clear in the story that it was Tsurugi. And as Tsurugi explains, the earthquake opened up a hole between the air vent and the bottom of the tree, which is how Yasuho got down here. The bunker itself is also a topic of discussion. Yasuho remarks that it feels like a prison. Later, she also sees a room that has an outfit that resembles Josuke's in it. Later still, Tsurugi tells Josuke that he recognizes him from being in the room before. Some ask what the purpose of this location was, as well as the meaning behind Josuke having supposedly been in the room. First, let's talk about the bunker itself. It was built by Yotsuyu Yagiyama, the architect of the new Higashikata Manor. According to Norisuke, he lived in the room in question while the house was being built. As for why the bunker feels like a prison, Tsurugi gives us the answer. He says that the bunker was made to hold members of the family while they were under the effects of the rock disease. We see later that once Tsurugi starts to show symptoms, he blacks out at times and does things involuntarily. This can be dangerous, as seen when Tsurugi lost control and used his stand to push a baby into the fountain. Tsurugi's stand isn't really meant for combat, but other types of stands may be even more dangerous if they lost control like this. In another example, Jobin nearly killed someone with his stand as a child. So this room was made for the purpose of holding them there safely until the time came for the equivalent exchange to cure the disease. Finally, what's up with the clothes? Well, Tsurugi says that he recognizes Josuke from there. The clothes being present there tells us that it must have been Kira, since he's the one who Josuke got his clothes from. We learned later that Norisuke and Kira were actually working together in some way. Norisuke was interested in curing the rock disease, and Kira was interested in curing Holly. So it's likely that Kira stayed in this bunker while he and Norisuke tried to investigate the Rokakaka. However, Kira likely already knew about the fruit, which he had Josefumi graft onto the trees in the Higashikata orchard. So I think Kira was keeping it quiet that he actually knew, and in the meantime, was able to watch the area around the branches from the Higashikata's property. When Kei went undercover as a maid, he also snuck into the house to alter the family tree. The reason he had such easy access to the house was also likely from staying nearby. When Yotsuyu is first introduced, he pulls some kind of plastic wrap from his eyes and mouth and uses this to waterboard Yasuho. A lot of people ask what this was supposed to be, since it doesn't fit with his stand ability, and they think it doesn't fit with the rock human abilities that were introduced later. On the contrary, I think this is definitely possible for him to do as a rock human. As we learn later, rock humans are silicon-based organisms. When they hibernate, they create a rock-like membrane around themselves. Other silicon organisms, such as the rock animal Doo-Doo-Doo-Da-Da-Da, was shown to be able to create the silicate mineral asbestos to attack its targets. This plastic-like sheet is no different. It's a silicon construct that Yotsuyu is creating, just like the membrane he's able to create during hibernation. When Norisuke uses King Nothing on the Rokakaka, he is able to reconstruct what part of the plant looks like. This plant has a big branch and large leaves similar to those from a fig tree. However, later when we see the plants, they're much smaller and lack the large leaves, leading to some confusion. However, what we need to keep in mind is that these are not the Rokakaka trees as they're likely seen in the wild. All of the trees that we're used to are miniature ones that are carried around in pots. In fact, if we take a closer look at the plant, the leaves are actually the same shape, just smaller. Similar to a dwarf fruit tree in real life, the appearance of this tree is likely different from what the fully grown ones might be like in New Guinea. Some have asked why Jobin, the oldest son of the family, isn't named Norisuke V, since every firstborn son of the family for the past 5 generations has had that name. However, we know that this is not the name that they're born with. If we look on the family tree, we can see that starting from Norisuke II, they're born with one name and then later change their name to Norisuke. The current patriarch of the family, Norisuke IV, was originally born with the name Josuke. Most likely, once the current Norisuke dies and the eldest son takes his place, he would then change his name. But since Norisuke IV is still around, Jobin still has his original name. Throughout Part 8's publishing, there are always debates over the return of certain characters. For quite a while, legit arguments were had over whether Kei and Kato would return to the story. Of course, they ultimately did do so. However, the one character that didn't end up fully returning is Karera. This was a girl that knew Josuke's past self, and she's first introduced for him to learn more about Josefumi and Kira. She has her own goal of finding the fruit since she thinks it'll help her escape from her life. She also promises to meet Josuke again, although when that would be is a secret. While Karera herself doesn't appear, she's actually mentioned in the final chapter. Josuke brings up his first encounter with Karera when he and Yasuho run into Josefumi's mom. While she didn't turn up again in Part 8, there's a possibility of her to return in Part 9, be it in the main story or in a flashback of some kind, similar to how Part 7 characters reappeared in Part 8. Since she had the goal of finding a fruit, and the final chapter alluded to more fruits existing on the islands to the south, that may be where we could expect her to turn up. When we're first introduced to Josuke's other half, Josefumi, we see that he has a joestar birthmark. This doesn't get mentioned again, but people ask how this is possible, since he shouldn't be related to the joestar family. However, I wouldn't be so sure. The family tree of the joestars that we have is actually very limited, and only includes the direct descendants down to Yoshikage Kira. Unlike the original universe, there's actually a ton of siblings that were had along the way. Johnny and Rena had not just their son George, but also an unseen daughter. Then George and Elizabeth had 4 children, including Joseph. So based on that, there could be potentially dozens of people who are related to Johnny. And since some of these are daughters, they wouldn't share his family name. So I think it isn't too far-fetched that one of these eventually resulted in Josefumi. This photo of Josefumi, Kira, and Karera has also led to some questions. People say that it shouldn't be possible for them to be pictured together like this, since Kira doesn't know who Karera is. However, nothing that Kira says suggests that he hadn't seen Karera before. In fact, he says he recognizes her as the one who's been following Josefumi around, and has even learned about her name and stand ability. Josefumi also recognizes her from his class. She seems to be somewhat delusional about their relationship, so I don't really see an issue with Karera having come up and snapped a picture of her and Josefumi as if they're together. In order to grow the fruit secretly, Josefumi stole the branches of the tree and grafted them onto another tree on the Higashikata property. I've gotten a comment saying that this shouldn't be possible, and that you can't just attach a branch from a tree onto a different one and expect that fruit to grow. However, this person seems to be unaware that tree grafting is a real thing, and that yes, you can actually grow a fruit on a different tree than normal through this process. When he first discusses this plan with Kira, Josefumi even demonstrates this and cuts the branches just like you do in real life. As for how Josefumi would know about all this, he actually mentions that he's an agriculture student. Some people say that the stand ability of Kira was changed. First, Kei mentions that Kira's stand could create exploding bubbles, but they say that later this stand just works like the normal Killer Queen, as well as having sheer heart attack. However, this is not the case. In all of the examples we see of Kira using his stand, he actually does have exploding bubbles. First, we see him place a bubble in Ojiro's face, which explodes, and later we see him place one in the tire of the motorcycle to cause it to crash. There's some confusion when it comes to Josuke's creation. Some people say that first the walleyes were said to be the reason, after Kei demonstrated the equivalent exchange, but that later the fruit was the reason for them fusing, and that the power of the walleyes was completely forgotten about. However, this was not the case. Both of these powers played a role in their fusion. First, Kira was injured and Josefumi fed him the fruit. This caused an exchange between the two. Since Kira was dying and Josefumi was exchanged to revive him, the two were both in a state of being half alive. Then the earthquake caused them to fall into the walleyes. Once there, parts of their bodies were swapped, leaving behind one living body, Josuke, and one dead body that was found in the same location. Others are confused over the changed power of the new Rokakaka. This came about after Josefumi grafted the branches onto the tree above the walleyes. This caused the power of the walleyes to combine with the fruit, which resulted in the new Rokakaka. While the normal fruit doesn't exchange within one person's body, the new fruit is capable of an exchange between two different people, similar to the walleyes themselves. Some people ask how it was possible that Josefumi and Kira got stands before the walleyes appeared in 2011. This comes from a misunderstanding of how the walleyes work. While the visible walleyes as we know them didn't rise up until after the earthquake, their power has always existed underground in Morioh. According to Ojiro, he gained his stand long before the earthquake. Then once the walleyes rose up, they came up from right under his house. Since he was so close to them that whole time, he got their power. The same is true for the Higashikatas, whose house is located right near the future location of the walleyes. They were using the power of the walleyes for generations to prevent the disease. So for all the stand users in Morioh, they simply developed stands over time due to the power the town held. The Milagro Man was a short 2-chapter arc that appeared in the middle of JoJolion. Some people have been confused as to what exactly the purpose of this arc was, since the actual Milagro Man curse itself didn't appear again. The greater purpose of the Milagro Man story was to tell us about the nature of curses. Ever since the first chapter, we know that JoJolion is a story about breaking a curse. The Higashikata rock disease is an example of one of these curses, but its origins are left unknown throughout the story. The Milagro Man gives us an idea of how curses actually operate. According to the narration of Chapter 1, a curse can be created from a sin committed in the past. This is the case with the Milagro Man, which came into being after a murder-suicide committed by an arms dealer. The Milagro Man itself has a stand form, which ties into the idea that's existed throughout the JoJo series, where what we see as curses is often actually a stand ability at work. As we know, stands are connected to the powers of spin and the miracles of saints, so a curse is like the opposite of a miracle, a negative flow of fortune. This was finally revealed to us later with the introduction of Wonder of You and the concept of Calamity. So the Milagro Man was there to not only give us a break between the two halves of JoJolion, but also serve as a miniature version of the story's overall conflict. One person asks about the scene where Josuke and Norisuke were looking at the security camera, and a mysterious rock human was shown sneaking around the orchard, but that this was never followed up on. However, this person seems to miss what happens a few pages later, where Josuke says that it isn't a rock human, but actually Jobin, who's looking for the grafted branch. There seems to be some confusion when it comes to the character Dolomite. Some people have said that Dolomite was originally a human, but then somehow became or was retconned into being a rock human. I literally have no idea how anyone could think this, and it was never said at any point that Dolomite was human. Others are confused in a different way, and think that Dolomite is a rock animal. This is at least understandable based on his freakish appearance, but as we saw from his flashback, he is in fact a rock human who is just scarred to look the way he is. Some confusion stems from a page later in the manga, which shows Dolomite alongside the rock animals. However, this page also features Yotsuyu, who was a rock human. It simply points out how all rock organisms, regardless of being humans or animals, have different ways of blending into society and nature. One person mentions that during the fight with Blue Hawaii, Josuke loses his shoes at the end of one chapter, but in the next chapter somehow has new shoes. What they seem to miss is the first page of the chapter, which literally shows Josuke at the shoe store buying shoes. In yet another shoe-related question, some people say that Blue Hawaii's ability is inconsistent. As we know, Josuke has to avoid being touched by the blood of the possessed people to avoid being possessed himself. But some people point out that in one instance, Josuke is touched on his shoe and is fine. But later when he's touched on his shoe, he ends up getting possessed. However, in the first instance, Josuke removed the shoe to avoid the blood from seeping in and touching him. This is how Josuke lost his shoes in the first place. But later, he allowed himself to get touched to avoid hurting the baby. This time, the blood seeped through and he wound up possessed. A lot of people bring up that Jobin Stan's Speed King was said to have some kind of hidden ability, but that this ability was never shown for the rest of the story. What they're referring to is the cover of Chapter 63, which features a blurb about Speed King. It says that even Jobin's family doesn't know about the ability's true nature. However, this doesn't actually say anything about some kind of hidden ability, only that Jobin's family members don't really know how his stand works. Like Norisuke said earlier in the story, the family prefers to keep their stands hidden from others. During the fight with Urban Gorilla, Mamazuku is forced to cut off the tips of his fingers of his left hand, and says that he can't get them back. Some people say that this was contradicted, and that he later had his fingers back with no problems. However, this is not the case. Throughout the rest of the story, Mamazuku can still be seen to be missing those fingers, all the way up to his final appearance. It's hard to see most of the time since often his left hand is off screen, but whenever it's seen from the front, his missing fingers are represented by these dark circles. Some people seem to be confused about the way that Jobin killed Makurin. They ask how it's possible that Speed King's ability works through a telephone. However, this is not what happened. Speed King is able to store heat inside of objects, and he can release this heat anytime he wants. This is what happened to Ojiro. Jobin stored the heat on the phone that Ojiro stole as well as the money. Once he had gone far away, Jobin activated the ability and killed Ojiro. Then he called the phone, and when Makurin picked it up, he activated that heat source to kill her as well. During the Wonder of You arc, Josuke blocks a man from coming near him with his bubbles, and the man ends up dying because of Calamity. After this, Josuke gets framed for murder and the cops start heading after him. Some ask how after the story is over, Josuke somehow is able to live normally without getting arrested. However, this is actually answered by Mamazuku in the scene when the man died. He says that the witnesses saw what happened, and they saw that Josuke was just protecting Yasuho. He says that while Josuke would get arrested, he'd eventually be found innocent and let out. However, the reason that they had to flee was because they were trying to find the fruit before the time of the harvest, and Josuke getting arrested would waste way too much time. Also during the Wonder of You arc, there's a moment when a girl named Mina is injured by a gate at Tsurugi's school. People think that it was Tsurugi that did it, but it turns out that it was Wonder of You. Some ask why Mina would be targeted, since the Calamity only affects people who pursue Wonder of You. However, this is not the only way that people are targeted by Calamity. We saw an example of this with the prisoner that Mamazuku was stuck with. All he did was try to look at Wonder of You, and he still got caught up in Calamity. As Mamazuku said, it operates based on a system of karma. In Mina's case, her karma got back at her for bullying Tsurugi earlier in the chapter. In Chapter 99, we get a detailed description of Rakuin biology as well as their relationship with the phenomena known as the blessings from the earth. One page goes over how the rock humans are indistinguishable from normal humans. Among the examples of women in the background are cameos from Hermes and Enya from the original universe of JoJo. Some people somehow took this to mean that these characters are rock humans. This obviously isn't the case. They're placed here as examples of human women, just like all the other people in the background. Later in the chapter, the stone mask and stand arrow are briefly shown. Some ask what the significance of this is, and if these items actually exist in this universe. They were shown here to tell us that these blessings from the earth that we're being introduced to are the next in the line of power-generating phenomena in the series. This has actually been done before. In the Steel Ball Run Extra chapter, we got a summary of what stands are, which includes various examples from previous parts. We are also shown the Devil's Palm alongside the mask and arrow as things that draw power out from people. This chapter also directly tells us that Spin and Hamon both act as pathways to gaining a stand. So while the mask and arrow don't exist in this universe, the manga uses them as parallels for us to better understand the role that the blessings will play. In one scene, the journalist Taka confronts Satoru Akefu after being sent knowledge of the Rokakaka by Josuke. Here, Akefu goes over the kind of bad luck you might experience from Calamity, which results in the small amount of the fruit that Taka was exposed to performing an exchange and killing him. However, some ask how this is possible, since Dr. Wu specified that you need 125 grams of the fruit to perform an equivalent exchange. While this may be true under normal circumstances, it definitely wouldn't be the case here. The extreme misfortune caused by Calamity has already been shown defying normal logic before, where even the smallest touch can cause grave injuries. So in this case, the small amount of fruit juice would be able to affect Tauka's body. In a flashback to Yasuho's childhood, we are shown her first meeting with Toru, where she uses her stand to locate the original Satoru Akefu, whose identity Toru uses to infiltrate the hospital. Some ask how it's possible that this is the case, when we also see Wonder of You in its old man form at Mamazuku's funeral, before this flashback happened. This is because the human form of Wonder of You has existed before Toru ever stole the identity. In the flashback chapter, we see the real Satoru Akefu, and he looks nothing like the head doctor. All Toru took was his name and background. The human form of Wonder of You that we see exists regardless. There's been some confusion when it comes to Josuke's final ability, Go Beyond. Some ask how Josuke gained this power in the first place, and others ask why he wasn't capable of using it until the final battle. Go Beyond is a power that was created by the fusion between Soft and Wet and Killer Queen. It's a special bubble that uses the power of explosive spin to operate outside of reality. This is similar to the golden rotation used in Part 7. This was the only power capable of passing Love Train, since it ignores reality. Similarly, Go Beyond is the only way for an attack to get past the logic of Calamity and hit Wonder of You. The reason that Josuke has this power is linked with his creation. The fusion between Josefumi and Kira has been repeatedly referred to as a miraculous occurrence that could never be repeated. The title, JoJolion, also is significant here. According to Araki, the suffix of JoJolion was chosen to mean Blessed One, and it signifies the existence of Josuke. Josuke's creation came about as a result of the positive forces of miracles. Thanks to the Walleye's power, and by extension Johnny and the Saint's corpse, Josuke was able to come into being, along with Go Beyond, and destroy Calamity. As for how he couldn't use it earlier, the answer is that he probably could. In the very first chapter, we see a bubble emerge from Josuke's shoulder just like Go Beyond does. But Josuke didn't have full knowledge of this ability until Mamazuku let him know about the connection between stands and spin. As a person who closely studied nature, Mamazuku was familiar with the golden ratio that exists in all natural life, so he was eventually able to figure out the connection between the golden ratio and stand abilities. Much like stands and Hamon, stands and spin are both different expressions of the same energy. In Part 7, we saw that mastery over spin can progress the evolution of a stand, and in a non-stand user, it can even unlock a stand outright. In Part 8, we see this process in reverse. Since all stands have the same rotational energy as spin inside of them, then it's possible to tap into that and use the spin as a stand user. This is what Go Beyond is. One of the biggest topics when it comes to Part 8 is the Chapter 83 flash forward. There we were shown a scene of the family acting normally, when Tsurugi goes upstairs and drags out Norisuke's body. We're shown that this takes place 15 minutes before the harvest, and then we are shown the events of the days leading up to this. Many people have said that this was completely forgotten about during the finale, and the events of the flash forward never happened. However, this is simply untrue. While the harvest timer itself has its own issues that I went over in a recent video, the actual flash forward itself still fits within the story. The most important thing to understand here is the way that the flash forward is intentionally misleading. The goal of it is to make you question Tsurugi's intentions. This continues in the subsequent arcs, where we see the incident with the gate, and Tsurugi starting to lose control of his powers. Later we see part of the flash forward come true, when Jobin knocks Norisuke unconscious with Speed King and puts him in a body bag just like we saw him earlier. However, this time the family is completely aware of his actions, unlike the flash forward where they seem oblivious. This is the main misdirection that the flash forward uses. The scene of the family actually takes place at a different time than the body bag scene. As you can see, at the end of the scene the shading changes to create a sort of blurry effect. This is something used throughout JoJolion to indicate the beginning and endings of flashbacks or narration. Here's another example from later in the same chapter. The screen tone appears before the flashback to Tsurugi's bullying, and then appears again when we transition back. So the scene with the family downstairs takes place in the present time, while the scene of the body bag upstairs occurs in the future. And later we do see the scene with the body bag take place, when Tsurugi drags the body down after the final battle. Some of the narration from chapter 83 is also repeated here. We're initially shown the flash forward without context, to make us think that Tsurugi went bad, but at the end we see it in context, and we see that hope won in the end. The last thing to talk about is the Higashikata curse. It's the main focus of JoJolion's story, with its stated purpose in the very first chapter to be a story about breaking a curse. There's still a lot of confusion surrounding the curse, however. First is the origins of the curse, and second is how exactly the curse was broken at the end. I think the answers to these two questions are linked. As we saw in the past, the Higashikata family has been dealing with the curse for a long time. They eventually began using the powers of the walleyes to exchange the disease to the other family members, but the next generation still always ended up having it, so it seems like avoiding the curse is impossible. However, one clue to breaking the curse does exist, and that's the legend of Johnny Joestar. Johnny's wife Rena suffered from the rock disease, so he used the corpse to transfer it away. However, it ended up in his son George. So Johnny made the ultimate sacrifice and transferred the disease to himself with the golden rotation. After this, not only were George and Rena cured, but none of Johnny's descendants were shown to suffer from the disease. It seems like he'd eradicated it entirely. So what exactly happened at the end of JoJolion? Kato appeared and performed an exchange between Tsurugi and Toru, transferring the disease to Toru, resulting in his death. After this, however, Wonder of You was still shown to exist. Yasuho says that Toru was just using his stand to manipulate the force of Calamity. In the end, Josuke appears and uses Go Beyond to destroy Calamity completely. While the origin of the curse is not directly shown, we can see from this and Johnny's legend that it originates from the negative forces of Calamity. Johnny's use of the golden rotation and Josuke's use of Go Beyond are the things that are able to bypass the logic of Calamity and eliminate the curse. In the first chapter, we're told that curses come into existence not only as a result of a sin in the past, but also as a result of the friction between light and dark. Later we learn at chapter 99 that at the creation of life, two paths were created, the carbon-based life and the silicon-based life. In part 7, the power of blessings that originates from the saint's corpse is described as light, so the opposite of that power, calamity, would be the darkness. And as chapter 1 said, the friction between these two at the creation of life is what resulted in the curse. I find it likely that this curse originates from so long ago that it's not even possible to really know the origin. But regardless, the power of miracles eventually led to the creation of Josuke, and the Go Beyond ability that eliminates the curse for good. And that's all of the Araki Forgot topics for JoJolion. It's definitely good to have finally taken a big look back at Part 8 after I've been following it since its publication over 7 years ago. And with Part 8's conclusion, it finally gives us an opportunity to dispel most of the confusion that built up around it over the years. As you can tell from the length of this video, this is the most in-depth I've gone with debunking Araki Forgot so far, and it's also my longest video to date. Of course, when it comes to the other parts, there's still going to be other topics to cover that could result in another extras video. But this time, it'll be able to include some Part 8 topics, now that the main video is finally done. Hopefully this video gave you a better understanding of the story of Part 8, and all of the elements that came together to create it. If you have requests for future videos, comment them down below. If you want to receive updates on new videos and chapters, you can join the Hamon Beat Discord using the link in the description. To receive rewards like Discord perks and some uncut videos, you can support the channel on Patreon. And finally, for future videos, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Tony, the Owl God, Keo, Alex Ramirez, Doorbell, Monkman, Ashton Joseph Miller, Crayon, Jesper Jansen, Rigo Vids, Sukato, Shane Yeager, Sentai, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Bailey Smile, Ali, Almighty Quarth, Oof, PBA SVG, Kaori, JoJo Agogo, and Tucker Gold.